On the show today, we'll discuss football as a unifying force in Nigeria as the World Cup fever catches on. As always, you can join the conversation with the hashtag #BeyondMarket, and you can follow my Twitter handle too at Esther Ubudaga. Now, beyond the feelings of nostalgia and patriotism when the history of Nigeria is being discussed, my guest says sports also played a significant role in shaping Nigerian nationality. Wiebe Boer, author of the book A Story of Heroes and Epics, joined me to discuss how football has been a unifying force in Nigeria since the colonial era. Thank you, Wiebe, for taking the time out to join us today. Interesting football, and I think the book is quite apt. Timing is good since we're about to enter another serious football season talking about the World Cup. Now, I'm not sure, but I would say I'm one of those people who've never really thought about Nigeria's football history, how it started, who started it, and those who were instrumental in making it the huge sport that it is for the nation today. But let's start with why you decided to put this book together, why you decided to write a book on the history of football in Nigeria.
Thank you very much for having me on the show today. I was actually born and raised in Nigeria, and anyone who grows up in this country feels the love for football and the emotions that are around football and the unity that the Super Eagles and the Super Falcons and all of them bring to Nigeria. And so when I was in graduate school at Yale University and thinking about what I was going to do for my dissertation topic, I wanted to write on something that was important to Nigeria. And so for the first 2 years of graduate school while I was doing coursework, I asked every Nigerian I met in Nigeria and around the world, what is something that is positive, national, unifying, and historical for Nigeria? And the only answer I had from anybody was football. Regardless of ethnicity, gender, religion, where they're from in Nigeria, socioeconomic class, anything, it was just football. And so I took that as a mandate and I said, okay, that's what I'm going to write on. And so what I've basically done is taken the story of how something completely foreign, there's not even any major Nigerian language that has a word for ball. So that this does, in Hausa it's kwalo, which is just a round seed. In Yoruba I think it's bolu.
Okay.
And in Igbo I think it's just ball. So it didn't even link it to something from the pre-colonial past. But in spite of that, it came this completely foreign thing, and over time, over a number of decades, it became this sort of national pastime, national phenomenon, to the point where it helped create this sense of Nigerianness and national unity even before independence.
Now, I know that, Nigeria has a very interesting history, and it's also quite interesting when you began to dig deep, looking at trying to collate data to see starting from how it all started and who the people were that, that started or pioneered the sport. But I also, on the other hand, thought about the availability of the data in the first place and how easy or how cumbersome it was to actually trace the data, find it, and have access to it. What was your experience?
Yeah, so I had to go to a number of places to get the data. First of all, archives on Nigeria are not that much, but then also this is a topic that's a bit on, if you think of what would be in the historical record, they're not necessarily going to be talking about football, right? So I basically started in the archives at Yale University. They have an amazing Africana collection. They have on microfilm every Nigerian newspaper from 1860 until today. Okay. And so basically I spent a long time looking at the microfilms on every Nigerian newspaper every day from 1860 until 1960. And so basically by tracing that, you now see the evolution of, the sport, but also the history of Nigeria through that. Now, that obviously sounds like a daunting task, but the reality is until the early, 1910, 1920, there was only one newspaper, and it was 2 pages a week. So you can go pretty quickly through that. From there, then I went to Rhodes House Archives in Oxford University. That's where they have the sort of personal papers of the colonial officials who were in Nigeria, and missionaries and others. And basically, it's the letters they sent home, it's the diaries they wrote, it's the memoirs they published, or just wrote. And in that, you got a rich sense of what they did outside of the office and how they observed Nigeria and what they thought of the place and what they did for recreation. And that's actually, so it's sort of the story outside of the official story that is where I collected the information. But then obviously the best part was in Nigeria, and I got a Fulbright fellowship to basically spend a year doing this. So imagine getting funding to do a year of research on a topic you absolutely love. It was just awesome. And so I went to the length and breadth of Nigeria, tracking down old players. Most of the guys, when I was doing my research, anyone who had played a significant role in football in colonial times was at least 80. So many of them had already passed away. There were some of them that I would hunt them down and then find out, they had passed away a year before or whatever. But even then, you would meet their families and you would hear their stories. And the highlight of that was actually meeting Etim Henshaw, who was the first captain of the Nigerian national team in 1949. He at the time was he had retired obviously a long time before, and he was living in Calabar. And I managed to hunt him down and spent several hours just hearing his story. But then also in Nigeria, we actually have richer archives than people realize. And so there's a national archive. There's one in Lagos.
Okay.
But then each of the former regional capitals have a very good archive, and that's Enugu, Kaduna, and Ibadan. And if you go to these archives, there's a rich treasure trove of material, especially from colonial days, that is very well organized, very well maintained. And so I went to that, and you could find anything you wanted from that period. And so I think when we say we don't have the data to write our history, it's not true. We actually have everything is there, we just don't use it.
We just don't bother.
Yeah. And when I would go to the archives, the archivist would be so excited because, oh wow, someone's actually here.
I can imagine.
Who's looking for something. So.
But when you looked at you talked about the letters from the missionaries on the side of the missionaries, those who brought the football, but then on the side of the players, the Nigerians themselves, what would you say was that one central theme in terms of how football shaped their lives back then, or their consciousness of being Nigerian back then?
Right. Well, in terms of how it shaped their lives, for many of them, at the time, football was not professional. It was the Nigerian Football Association was under the English FA, and the English FA mandated that Nigerians could not be professionals. And so football always had to be something you did on the side. But a lot of these guys, they went through primary and secondary school as stars, and then from there were recruited straight into the colonial institutions that had good football teams. So one example is Justin Onwudiwe, who was an amazing defender. He grew up in Enugu. And he said as he was finishing secondary school, like from the graduation ceremony, someone had come from railway in Lagos to sign him up and give him a job in the railway so that he could play football. Because officially he was an employee of the railway, not a football player. And so for him, obviously, it gave him opportunities that he otherwise would not have had. And this is like 1945.
But was it seen back then by the Nigerians as an opportunity to do great things or be great in that sport? Did that sport have that, what it has now, knowing that if you're good, if you have the talent and you're able to, if you're sought after by a good club, your life could literally change? Did they have an inkling of that back then?
Well, it doesn't change as much because in the end it's more it got you a good job, not millions of dollars of revenue. But it was the same, I think, as we have today, where the kids, when they're getting obsessed with football, the parents are always concerned. Very few are going to make it. Are you wasting your time? So it was the same thing. But I think, especially in the bigger towns, it was pretty clear that if you did well in football, it was a way to get a better colonial job than you might otherwise get.
Now, football wasn't the only sport that was introduced to Nigerians. We had polo, we had a number of other sports. From your findings, what would you say was responsible for that love, that special love that Nigerians developed and still have for the sport?
Right. So cricket is actually the one that's the most interesting story, because in the 1890s, 1900s, 1910s, cricket was actually very big in Nigeria. I mean, in the sort of elite circles, right? And there was actually a plan to set up a West African cricket federation, sort of like what the West Indies have, where all the countries play together. And we were supposed to have sort of a West African cricket with Gambia, Gold Coast, Sierra Leone, Nigeria. It never panned out. There just was never that much interest. But up until the 1930s, cricket was actually bigger than football. But what happened is that cricket obviously is far more expensive and complicated to play. You need a lot more equipment. Football, you just need a ball and a field. You don't even need a goal. And a ball you can actually make out of anything you want. But cricket obviously didn't have that. You needed the proper equipment. You needed a special kind of facility. But then cricket was also organized along racial lines. So there was a European cricket board and an African cricket board. In football, I think there was one year where there was some kind of European Football Association in Lagos, a committee, but it didn't last. And for the most part, from the beginning, Lagos District Amateur Football Association was the first sort of organized football body, and it was, interracial from the beginning. The Nigerian Football Association, when it was started in 1933, it was, right from the beginning, the president or the chairman was a colonial guy, but then the vice presidents were Nigerian from the beginning. And so there was never that sense that there was this kind of racial division within it. But then also there's the reality that, there's something about the Nigerian character that's very about spontaneity, virtuosity, and you can't really do that in cricket, but in football you can. You know, and so in the end of the day, though, cricket was the one that was more promoted. Yet Nigerians took to football, which was the sport that was being played by not the senior colonial officials or military officers. It was played by the junior officials, by the traders, by the missionaries, by the sort of lower class of the British elite. And that's the sport that Nigerians took on. And so even the fact that Nigeria took to football and not cricket was itself a form of colonial protest.
You also mentioned in the book how the role the founding some of the founding fathers, likes of the late Awolowo, Nnamdi Azikiwe, played in also shaping football that we have today. Help us understand that.
Yeah, so it's not really well known, but Nnamdi Azikiwe was probably the most important figure in the development of football in Nigeria. Obviously, he's far more well known for the political role he played and all that. But his first claim to fame was that he was a footballer. So he was actually a star in the Lagos leagues in the 1920s. So not just an organizer of the game, but a player. He was a very good player. He then was the captain of the Lincoln University football team, or soccer since it's in the United States, when he was a student there. And he was actually a very good all-around athlete. And so on his way back from the United States to Nigeria, he went to England. And he was basically trying to get a place on the English team for the 1938 Empire Games. Or I guess it would have been 1938. Yeah. And they said, "Oh, but you're not English." He said, "But you guys are our colonial, you know, so how am I not English?" And so they rejected him. So obviously that had an impact. He then went back to Nigeria and wanted to join the Yoruba lawn tennis club and was rejected because he wasn't Yoruba. And he just thought, wait, this is my country, my own country, how can this happen? So he said, look, sports is such an important thing for our development. So he used his own money, and set up a network of clubs around Nigeria that were called the Zeeks Athletic Clubs. And basically every major city in Nigeria had one. And that club had facilities for multiple sports, but most importantly, football. And he just opened it to anybody who wanted to play. You know, and so he kind of had that pan-Nigerian view right from the beginning. And then he basically took players from from those clubs on tours of Nigeria during World War II, where he was far ahead of his time, because what they did is the purpose of the tours, the stated purpose was to raise money for the war effort, right? So because of that, the colonial officials, then had to support it because this is for the war effort, and so they would be at stadiums, they would be playing. In places like Burutu in the Niger Delta. They said they had an amazing field, and there were something like 10,000, 15,000 people watching this match against the ZAC 11 and the local team. And the colonial official, the senior colonial official, would be sitting next to him, and then sitting next to him when he gave a speech after, and talked about independence and talked about democracy and freedom. And he couched it in the fact that the whole World War II was being fought for that. And so he was doing anti-colonial protests in that manner, long before anyone else. And the ANC used football, decades later to do the same thing, but he kind of set the trail for that.
I've been speaking to Wiebe Boer, author of A Story of Heroes and Epics. We're continuing our journey into the history of football in Nigeria with my guest, Wiebe Boer, author of A Story of Heroes and Epics. Now, the British introduced football as a way of promoting British values, but somehow Nigerians found a way to just make it theirs. Explain that to us.
Well, so the British actually introduced sports in general as a way to inculcate British values, and there was very much this belief that, by playing organized sports, it helped develop leadership and developed, how to be a team player and how to be someone reliable. And I think we still think that today. But in those days, it was actually a relatively new innovation that you would introduce sports as an important part of education and so on. So within that, there was the hierarchy of, obviously polo was the most elite, and then there was cricket, and then a bunch of other things, and then somewhere down below was football. So many of the early colonial-founded schools wouldn't necessarily have football teams immediately. It would be something else. And then over time, the students would insist, we want to play football. And that was through that it was one of the ways that they kind of said, no, we're going to do what we want to do. But football had a really big role. A lot of how it started and spread initially was actually from these schools. The first recorded game of football that we have in Nigeria was in 1904 in Calabar.
Okay. And would you say, it spread very fast?
Yes, it did. And it's interesting because you can sort of trace the consciousness of being in Nigeria along with how football spread, right? So as the colonial presence kind of expanded, and there would be more cities and towns that would have some colonial officer, traders or something like that, that kind of brought them into that world. Football would also be there, so you can almost trace that growth. But in every case, football took off very quickly and is one of the things that stayed. So it was, the railway, the military, the Nigeria Regiment, the Nigeria Police, Marine, Post and Telegraphs, all of these colonial institutions helped because they posted people all over the country, and then they would
Would you say that, I'm not sure if that was part of the plan, but what was the response, the British, in terms of how it spread? And what was the response to how Nigerians took to the sport so easily and with so much love and passion? Were they concerned? Were they happy? What was the response?
Yeah, no, there was even, especially there was a concern in the core north, in the far north, where the British worked very hard to protect the tradition there. So it was such that, Christian missionaries were not allowed there. The number of Western educational institutions was very few. And so they tried really hard kind of to reduce that influence. And so even in the few elite schools that there were in that region, football was not highly promoted, and that's where kind of polo was really popular with the emirs and so on. Even in the 1950s, actually, the sitting emir of Katsina was one of the top 3 polo players in the world, Usman Nagogo. But at the same time, even in these schools, the boys learned about football and took to it. And even though there was this sort of myth that Northerners didn't play football, you actually found it all over the place. And even in sort of obscure third-tier northern cities, they had people playing football. What was interesting, though, is that it's not until the late 50s that schools in the south would play schools in the north. And so that division that we, in some ways, still have today, part of it was because there was not a conscious effort to bring everybody together.
So, in terms of bringing everybody together, obviously we know that it became back then a unifying tool. Now, fast forward to present-day Nigeria, how football continues to play that role, unifying. Like I said, we're in another football season, and all eyes are going to be glued to TV sets, cheering on the Super Eagles. In terms of its role in present-day Nigeria in nation building, how would you describe it, perhaps compared to back then, what the kind of transition that we've seen, and how strong that message is right now? Yeah,
no, I think we're still at the place where I found 15 years ago when I was asking Nigerians what brings us together, and football is still really one of the only forces that does. And it is exciting because I love football and so many of us love football and it brings us together, but as a nation, that's not enough. And so we really need to learn from what football has done and find other arenas that can create that unity and pride and all that. But I think if you look at the build up to the World Cup, nobody's talking about, who's from the north and who's from the south and who's Christian and who's Muslim. Nobody actually cares, because it's what we want our best 23 players, we want our best 11 on the field. And even if all of them were from one town, I don't think anyone would care. Now, what's interesting, was being born and raised in Jos, our current captain, second captain, and third captain are all guys who grew up in Jos.
That's the Plateau United.
Well, Mikel initially played for Plateau United, but then Onazi grew up in Jos, and Ahmed Musa grew up in Jos. And none of them are indigents of Plateau. They're from different parts of Nigeria, but they grew up there. But nobody is making that, that's a problem. That can't be. And in other arenas, that would be a problem, right? And I think we need to look at it that way, that we really, to build this nation, we need to look at it from a national perspective. We need to put people in positions who are there because of merit, not because of where they're from. And I think there's a lot we can learn from football to help us get there.
Do you think that as a nation we've been able to fully harness that potential? Like the examples you just gave, nobody looks at whether tribal, even religion. It's just those are our best guys, and let's all cheer them on to win. Do you think that over the years we have been able to fully harness that potential and use it more for national unity?
I think beyond football, I think we're still not there.
And there's no way, you don't see, if politicians or just us as a nation using the sport itself to better unify the country.
Right, and that is exactly what's being done, but I'm saying we need to go beyond that.
Beyond that, but that's not enough. Yeah. What about women's football? Right. At what point did that take off?
Yeah, so women's football, there's a chapter on women's football in the book, but because like I mentioned earlier, the Nigerian Football Association was under the English FA. The English FA was not in favor of women's football. And so women's football was not allowed in Nigeria. And so in girls' schools, there was no football. They would play handball or something else. In colonial times, the period that I write about, you'll find periodic sort of charity matches where there'll be a women's team playing a men's team. And the women's team, the entire 11 would switch at halftime because the assumption was women couldn't, play through the whole match.
Interesting.
There was an early match that I found in the 1930s in Makurdi. And, the only name mentioned was a woman named Mero Fulani, who was the star striker of the women's team. So you see a few names like that, but for the most part, it's almost not there. What many people don't realize is that women's football only became official in 1989. And so up until then, even in schools and all that, women's football was not really promoted. And if you think about that, in '89 it was made official. There was finally a Nigerian women's team. By 1991, 2 years later, they were already in the World Cup. I think 1999 women went on to the quarterfinals. The men have never got there. In 2001 or so, the Nigerian women beat England. No other senior team in Africa has ever beat England. So our women have actually done better in Africa and internationally than our men. Yet it was only a few years after being organized. The men took, 60, 70 years to get there.
But it would appear that, there's still, when we talk football in Nigeria, that consciousness is still around the male national team. Like, they are the ones who play the real football. Women's, could be entertaining. Do you think that mindset will change, or it's just, just what it is?
I think it's what it is.
That's the sense I get.
Yeah, I think it's what it is. But if you do remember, when the Super Falcons are playing in the World Cup, there's a lot of excitement, and even when Nigeria has hosted the Women's African Cup a couple of times, and usually they play the games in second-tier cities. The assumption is you can't fill a stadium, and Abeokuta Stadium would fill up because people wanted to see it. So I think that is getting more and more recognition. But the reality is, there's only a few countries in the world, maybe USA, Norway, China, where women's football is actually much bigger than men's football. And I think that's just the reality. But at least there is we can be very proud of the accomplishments of the Nigerian women's team.
Yeah, interesting book. Two questions. We have about 2 minutes left. What would you say in putting this book together, the biggest challenge you encountered?
The biggest challenge was actually what not to put in, because I found so much amazing material that I wanted to just tell every story. And so the initial dissertation was 449 pages long. Okay. And this book is more like 150. And so I first had to make that choice while doing the dissertation. And then to get this book down to a readable size that the public could be interested in. Bookcraft, the publisher, actually provided an editor, a guy named Kunle Kass. He does the Channels Book Club. And his role then was to cut it down to a size that made sense. And it almost had to be another person, because I'm the one who went to the length and breadth of Nigeria to, every piece of information I remember the effort that went into getting it. So I just didn't want to remove everything.
Okay, and about that, what would you say was the most interesting or the most intriguing factor that you encountered, as it were?
You mean
while you're putting the material together?
Well, I put the book together. The most interesting thing, I would say, was I found an amazing headline in 1955 that Nigeria had just been beaten 7-0 by Gold Coast.
Oh, wow.
And the response was, "This is worse than us not getting independence." And I think that sort of,
So it was already important back then.
I did not think I would find that in the colonial period. I thought that kind of obsession with football was something that happened in the 70s or 80s. But it was already there in 1955. And that, I think, kind of capped off that, the story I've found and told is actually the right one.
Okay, one last question. What do you want readers to go away with when they read this book? One thing.
The one thing is, this book it uses football to tell a unifying history of Nigeria where everybody is part of the story, regardless of ethnicity, race, etc., and regardless of political orientation, etc. Okay. But it's really a history of Nigeria, and I think it's a way of telling Nigerian history that shows how we can all be unified and together. And I hope that the readers can read it and learn about that and see that, and then we can find other arenas that same unity can come out.
That was Wiebe Boer, author of A Story of Heroes and Epics.